So our speaker tonight is RTB scholar Dr. Kirk Bertsche, and Kirk earned his PhD in physics from the University of California, Berkeley in 1989. His graduate research involved the design, construction, and operation of a small, low-energy cyclotron for radiocarbon dating. Dr. Bertsche's worked at a number of Department of Energy national laboratories on projects involving particle accelerator design and operation, including radiocarbon dating with AMS. He has over 60 scientific publications and 18 patents. In addition to being an RTB scholar, he's an officer in our chapter. He and his wife, Sabina, live in San Jose. And at this time, I'll unshare my presentation and ask you to welcome Kirk Bertsche.
Once upon a time, there was a family of mice that lived inside a piano. Every afternoon, they heard beautiful music played by a concert pianist. They'd never seen or met the pianist. They knew about him from their parents, who had been told about him from their parents. One day, there was a little proto-scientist mouse. He crawled around in the piano while the music was playing, and he discovered there were strings that were vibrating. And he scampered back to his friends and told them, "There's no piano player, it's just strings." And a number of little mice followed him and started investigating, and they discovered strings and hammers. And they got rid of this foolish theory that there was a pianist, and they started teaching that there was just strings and hammers. There was no pianist. Now, inside the piano, the mice are confined inside their piano. So they can't actually see or meet the pianist, but they can see evidence of the pianist. They can interpret it different ways. They can interpret it as evidence of a pianist, or they can try to interpret it all through hammers and strings. How in the world would they know that there is a pianist? How would they get any idea of that? And I think the analogy is clear for us. We're confined within the physical universe. How do we know there's anything beyond that, anything spiritual, anything outside the physical universe? Is there any evidence of that? That's what we want to look at tonight. We want to look at evidence for God, and we're going to look at two main questions tonight. The main question is there a God? Does he exist? And then a secondary question, if he does exist, is he still active in the universe? And what I'd like to do is just confine our discussion tonight to two different worldviews, look at everything in terms of two worldviews, either naturalism or biblical theism. And we're going to look at both of these worldviews and see how would they answer these questions. Is there a God, and is he active? Now, what do we mean by naturalism? It's captured by the statement that has been ascribed to Yuri Gagarin, but it was really Nikita Khrushchev that said these words. Said, "I went up to space, but I didn't encounter God." He was the first astronaut, a cosmonaut, to go into space. Or Carl Sagan says the cosmos is all that is or was or ever will be. That's naturalism, that the physical universe is all that there is, nothing beyond it, and that's it. Biblical theism, in contrast, says that there is a God and he is active in the universe. David expresses this in Psalm 19. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. Day to day force speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words, their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their utterances to the end of the world. And so he says here, the first two verses, he says, this is continuous. It keeps happening. The heavens keep telling the glory of God. The expanse keeps declaring the work of his hands. It happens every day and every night, according to verse 2. It's universal. It There's no actual speech, no actual words. It goes through all the earth, and the utterances go to the end of the world. So according to David, nature proclaims to everyone everywhere that God exists. The Apostle Paul said something similar in the New Testament. He says that which is known about God is evident within them, for God has made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. So he says it's clear to all. It's still clear. There are some Christians who think it's not very clear after the fall, but according to Paul, it is still clear that God has created things and that God is in charge of the world. So we want to look at these two worldviews tonight. And I want to remind you of the scientific method. Some of you may be familiar with this, some may not. Scientific method is kind of a circular approach where we formulate a theory, we predict consequences of that theory, we perform experiments, and then we observe results. And then it either supports the theory or we modify the theory so that it better explains reality. In the scientific method, we don't ever prove scientific theory. And that's misunderstood by a lot of non-scientists, but scientific theories aren't proven. They're evidenced or supported. And the logic is, if the theory is true, then these predictions will come true. So tonight, I'd like to look at these two worldviews and compare them as we would do two opposing scientific theories. Often in science, we have different theories, and we try to decide which theory is better by looking at what they predict and doing experiments and seeing which one is better supported by the data. So I'd like to do that tonight with two worldviews, naturalism and biblical theism. And we'd like to look at some evidences and say which one of these worldviews best explains the evidence that we see. So there's 6 different areas I'd like to look at. These are the 6 areas: the design of the universe, the existence of the universe, the comprehensibility of the universe, and then mathematics and beauty and morality. So 6 areas. And do we see evidence for God in these areas? Which better explains the data that we see, naturalism or biblical theism? So first of all, design. There's the slide I was looking for. Somehow it didn't. All right. First of all, design. This is the Milky Way, and it's not a photograph. Of course, there's no way to get a camera that far away to take a photograph, but this is a reconstruction of what the Milky Way looks like based on measurements to stars. And you see that the center of the galaxy is up here. We believe there's a black hole at the center. The sun and our solar system is down below. The sun is not near the center of the galaxy. If it were, the radiation would be way too high and no life could exist. The sun is not out at the edge of the galaxy. If it were, there would not be enough heavy elements to form the necessary components for life. The sun is partway out. It's not in one of the major arms. Again, there'd be too much radiation there. It's in a minor arm of the spiral galaxy. And this is all kind of a new realization since the 1970s. Until about the 1970s, people thought that we were just an average planet in an average solar system in an average galaxy. It's called the Copernican principle. And now we know that we're in a very special place in the galaxy and a special place in our solar system. And there's lots of things that are just right for life In our solar system, we're just at the right range of distance from the sun. If we were much closer to the sun, like Mercury, there'd be no liquid water. It would all be vaporized. If we're too far, like Mars or Saturn, it would be frozen. And you need liquid water for life, as far as we know. So there's lots of things like this that are just right. And there's the book by Gonzalez and Richards is very good on talking about this. The way things are just right for life. It looks like many things here were designed to allow us to be here. Second evidence for design is how do we get the heavy elements? How do we get carbon and other heavy elements? We believe the early universe was just hydrogen and helium. Helium was fused from two hydrogen atoms. But how do you get heavier elements than helium? If you were to fuse two helium atoms together, helium-4, you'd get beryllium-8. But beryllium-8 is not stable. It would fall apart. And so how do you get all the way up to carbon? You have to fuse 3 helium atoms together to get carbon. And you can't do it. Once you get 2 together, they fall apart. The only way it can happen is in the center of stars where the pressure is extremely high, the temperatures are extremely high, and you can get 3 heliums to come together with enough time that it'll form a carbon atom. And it relies on there being a resonant state of carbon. So this was a puzzle back in the 1950s, and Fred Hoyle looked at that and he said, well, the only way this could happen is if there is a resonant state in carbon that we don't know about. And so he predicted this resonant state. It was found by Willie Fowler experimentally, and this left Hoyle greatly shaken. He said nothing shook his atheism more than this discovery. This fine-tuning of carbon implied some design in the universe. And Hoyle himself said a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. So this is one of the evidences for design and for a creator. The Big Bang itself, the Big Bang theory was proposed in 1931 by Lemaitre, who is a physicist, astronomer, and Catholic priest. And he may have gotten the idea from Edgar Allan Poe, which is another interesting story we don't have time to go into tonight. This theory of the Big Bang was strongly resisted by naturalists. An eternal universe had been favored ever since ancient Greece. The view of most scientists and others was that the universe was eternal. But then experimental evidence for the Big Bang was found by Penzias and Wilson in 1962. They found the cosmic background radiation. And we understand this Big Bang now to be the beginning of all space and time and matter. And it wasn't just an explosion, it was an extremely fine-tuned expansion. The fine-tuning of this Big Bang it's incredibly fine-tuned. In order for the universe to still be here after 13.8 billion years, the expansion had to be just right, just at the right rate. If it would have expanded too fast, there would not have been time for stars and galaxies to form. If it would have expanded slower, it would have collapsed in on itself long before the 13.8 billion years. So the mass density of the early universe has to be very precisely tuned, and the precision is 10 to the minus 60th of the Planck scale. That's a natural scale factor set by quantum mechanics and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle And you would expect something within that to be just randomly within that Planck scale. To have it fine-tuned to a part in 10 to the 60th is just, it's almost ridiculous. It's ridiculously fine-tuned. So why is it so finely tuned? And how does this come about? Well, some would say there's got to be some unknown physics that's forcing it, that it can't be really, that nothing can be fine-tuned that finely. There must be some physics that forces it to be exactly that value. That's a view of Victor Stenger and others. But that, in a sense, just kicks the can down the road. It's saying, well, the fine-tuning is being forced, but then the thing that forces it is kind of miraculous in itself. Some would opt for a cyclic universe, a universe that expands and then contracts and collapses and expands again. But that's pretty much ruled out. The discovery of dark energy a few years ago it tells us that the universe is expanding. The expansion rate is increasing. As it expands out, you'd expect it to expand slower and slower due to gravity, but it's now expanding faster because of something that's called dark energy. Nobody really understands it. It was one of my classmates at Berkeley that discovered that and shared the Nobel Prize in physics. And the most popular view for this fine-tuning is the multiverse, that there's an infinite or nearly infinite number of universes, and we happen to be in the one that is just right for life. The others either collapse too early or don't form stars, but we're in the one that's just right. And it's questionable whether that's even a scientific theory, because you can't test these other multiverses. You can't go to visit them and do experiments on them because they're separate from our universe. And then the other explanation for this fine-tuning is divine design, that God made it and he tuned it finely like this. So the choices pretty much come down to the two popular choices are an infinite number of universes or an infinite God. So this fine-tuning is recognized by most physicists and cosmologists. Stephen Hawking said this many years ago, 1988. The laws of science as we know them at present contain many fundamental numbers, like the size of the electric charge, the electron, and the ratio of masses of proton and electron. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. So Stephen Hawking said it seems to be fine-tuned. And Paul Davies says it seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. Now, neither of these two men holds to the worldview of biblical theism, yet they recognize the evidence for design, or the appearance of design at least. And if we look at biology, biological design is maybe even more amazing. Let's see if this plays.
What you are about to see is DNA's most extraordinary secret. How a simple code is turned into flesh and blood.
Can you hear?
It begins with a bundle of factors assembling at the start of a gene.
Yes, we can hear.
A gene is simply a length of DNA instructions stretching away to the left. The assembled factors trigger the first phase of the process, reading off the information that will be needed to make the protein. Everything is ready to roll. 3, 2, 1, go. The blue molecule racing along the DNA is reading the gene. It's unzipping the double helix and copying one of the two strands. The yellow chain snaking out of the top is a copy of the genetic message, and it's made of a close chemical cousin of DNA called RNA. The building blocks to make the RNA enter through an intake hole. They are matched to the DNA, letter by letter, to copy the A's, C's, T's, and G's of the gene. The only difference is that in the RNA copy, the letter T is replaced with a closely related building block known as U. You are watching this process called transcription in real time. It's happening right now in almost every cell in your body.
So that's pretty amazing, this DNA transcription. And there's all these specialized little mechanisms that split apart the DNA, copy, make a duplicate of it, and there's some of these are like a little, almost like a read head on a tape recorder that pops down and reads, and it's amazing, and in talking about origin of life research, people are trying to figure out how to make DNA, but making DNA is only the first piece of the puzzle. It's not the biggest piece of the puzzle. As Anthony Flew said, Anthony Flew gave up atheism at age 81. He was a famous philosopher, and he became a theist or a deist. I'm not quite clear, but he gave up his atheist position. And the reason was this biological design. He says the philosophical question that has not been answered in origin of life studies is this: how can a universe of mindless matter produce beings with intrinsic ends, self-replication capabilities, and coded chemistry? Here we're not dealing with biology, but entirely a different category of problem. So even if you could make a DNA molecule, what gives meaning to that DNA molecule? What would cause anything else in the universe to see this as codes for genes? You have to have a bunch of mechanisms out there that'll interpret it as genetic coding. Without that, the DNA molecule is just sitting there, not doing anything. And where do you get that meaning, that semiotics? How do you put the meaning into the DNA? And that was the kind of thing that convinced Anthony Flew that there must be a God to design these things. So why do we see all this evidence of design in the universe, in the stars, in biology? Naturalism would say that this is all illusion. It's chance. It just looks like design, but it's not real design. Biblical theism would say it is design because there's a creator who designed it. So those are our two worldviews. And which one of those better explains what we see with all this evidence for design? Another thing I want to look at is existence of the universe. As Stephen Hawking said, the usual approach of science of constructing a mathematical model cannot answer the question of why there should be a universe for the model to describe. Why does the universe go to all the bother of existing? Is the unified theory so compelling that it brings about its own existence, or does it need a creator? And if so, does he have any other effect on the universe? Many great thinkers have asked, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe exist? With naturalism, it's kind of a puzzle that's unsolved. With biblical theism, it's fairly easy. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's what the Bible says in Genesis 1:1. How about the comprehensibility of the universe? Why is it understandable? These four equations are what's known as Maxwell's equations. And he was in the middle of the 19th century. Maxwell, James Clerk Maxwell, put together these four equations. They describe all of electricity and magnetism static magnetism, dynamic electromagnetism, all of these things are described by these four equations. And most of my career has been invested in using these equations and making practical use of them by making different products. Why can we understand the universe well enough to reduce all of electricity and magnetism to simple equations that you can put on a t-shirt? Einstein asked the question, well, he said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. You find it strange that I consider the comprehensibility of the universe as a miracle or an eternal mystery. Well, a priori, one should expect a chaotic world, which cannot be grasped by the mind in any way. A high degree of ordering of the objective world could not be expected a priori. That's the miracle which is being consistently reinforced as our knowledge expands. So you see what Einstein is saying here. He's saying if everything happened randomly, if there's no design and no designer, if everything came about randomly, it should behave randomly. Why does it not behave randomly and chaotically? Why is nature comprehensible? To naturalism, it's a puzzle. To biblical theism, it's because, why is it comprehensible? To biblical theism, it's because we're made in God's image and we can understand something of what God has done. Another evidence is mathematics, and most physicists are familiar with this quote by Eugene Wigner, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the physical sciences. He says, the enormous usefulness of mathematics in the natural sciences is something bordering on the mysterious, and there is no rational explanation for it. The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. So he's saying, why can we reduce, why is mathematics, which is often, we often get mathematics through just theoretical sitting and thinking, and then why do the results of that apply to the universe? We're not getting our mathematics by studying the universe. We're getting mathematics from pure thought, and then it works to describe the universe. And one example I believe Wigner gave in this paper is Maxwell's equations that I just showed. They were discovered before the discovery of radio waves, but they describe radio waves perfectly. Why does mathematics have such power? And where did math come from anyway? Was it invented or discovered? There's a bit of a debate between mathematicians and others, but I think most mathematicians say that they discover this. It's not something we invent, it's something we discover. Let me ask you, before the Big Bang, was it true that 2 + 2 is 4? Isn't that an eternal truth that's always true, whether the universe is here or that 2 + 2 is 4? And if so, how can mathematics come from the universe? It has to be something that's transcendent of the universe. Math and logic, it would seem, are both things that are here, that are true, whether the universe is here or not. So they both transcend the universe. So under naturalism, you've got really no explanation for these eternal truths of math and logic. You've got to really expand naturalism to kind of a naturalism plus that includes math and logic as well as nature in the physical world. But under biblical theism, mathematics is, we're discovering God's methods. We're discovering how God works. And another evidence I want to look at is beauty. This is a picture of the Crab Nebula. And there's many astronomy photos we could show that I should have put more in here, sorry. But lots of things we could show the beauty of the universe. It's just very beautiful to look at. And why do we find it beautiful? It doesn't seem to perform any function for us to be beautiful. And then also music. Music is also something that we find beautiful. There's something transcendent about music. A number of people have said that their faith journey started by listening to Bach. According to Walter Isaacson, Steve Jobs, after he heard Yo-Yo Ma play for him at his home, teared up and said, "Your playing is the best argument I've ever heard for God, because I don't really believe a human alone could do this." And music and nature, why do we find them beautiful? What gives this transcendent quality to these things? Naturalism would say, well, it's all Darwinian. But how? How is there some gene for the love of beauty or of music? How does that work? Biblical theism says God loves beauty and man is made in God's image. And then morality, if you look at it from all societies have a sense of good and bad, but where does that come from? Richard Dawkins says the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So he's saying there's no good and bad. There's no evil and good at the bottom of the universe. But everybody has a sense of good and evil. Even Richard Dawkins has a sense of good and evil. Where does that sense come from? I don't believe there is a good explanation under naturalism for this sense of good and evil. And so why does God allow evil? Why would a good God allow evil and suffering? That's a big topic. We don't have time to cover that tonight. But if you want to look back at this talk tonight is part of a series that we gave at Hillview Bible Chapel and Grace Bible Chapel. And the Hillview Bible Chapel sermons are on YouTube. You can go and look them up. And there was another sermon in this series by someone else about evil and suffering. So I could recommend that one, but that's more than I'm going to cover tonight. Naturalism has a big problem here. How would we consider anything to be good or evil? Why do we think something is good or evil? One of the explanations that's given is what's called social Darwinism, that in society, people kind of learn that some things are helpful, some things are not, and they then label them good and evil. But it's very difficult to explain things like altruism. And an acquaintance of mine, Cy Gart, points out that this is not the same as biological Darwinism. It's not passed through genes. This social Darwinism is kind of a fake thing. And it's hard to defend this idea of social Darwinism being passed along. I think under naturalism, a view of someone like Hitler would be a more reasonable Darwinian response, that the survival of the fittest, you wipe out people that you don't like. You don't have things like altruism where you're trying to help those who are disadvantaged. But in biblical theism, morality makes sense. God has put a sense of morality in everyone. So 6 different evidences here that I was looking at for evidence for God. None of these are proofs that God exists. These are evidences, and any of these evidences could be argued against. But look at these evidences like threads in a tapestry. Which tapestry better explains the threads that we've looked at? Naturalism or biblical theism? Which worldview better explains these evidences? Now, some cautions. There's some arguments for God that I did not use. There's a whole class of arguments called God of the gaps, where we look at something that science can't explain and we say, well, science can't explain it, so it must be God that does it. That's a dangerous way to argue, and what happens is as we learn more things in science, it causes God to shrink, and he shrinks away as science progresses. When I was a kid, I don't know how many sermons I heard where people would talk about how in the nucleus of an atom, you've got protons and neutrons, and these protons should repel each other. And so the nucleus should fly apart, but it doesn't. And they said, we don't have an explanation for that. So God is that must be evidence for God. God is holding the nucleus together in the atom. Well, I grew up in rural Indiana and went to church in Indiana and Ohio. And the preachers there just didn't know even the science of their day, because we understood nuclear forces back then, that there are short-range forces in the nucleus that do hold it together. So arguments like that are not a good way to argue for God's existence. But the evidences that I used here, they all get stronger, not weaker, as our scientific knowledge expands. They're not God of the gaps arguments. They're the opposite. They're arguments that get stronger as we learn more. Things like the fine tuning. We learn more and more about fine tuning, and it becomes more and more amazing. The other argument to avoid is science is wrong. There are a number of Christians who argue that modern science is wrong, that the universe is only 10,000 years old, and it's not 13.8 billion. And that's not a good way to argue either. All of the evidence I've looked at for supposed evidence, scientific evidences for a recent creation, all of those are bogus that I've seen, and they're easily disproved. I have never seen any good scientific evidence for a 10,000-year-old Earth, and I don't think there is any. But instead of trying to argue that science is wrong, I think we should argue that science is limited. And we're in good footsteps if we argue that way. Erwin Schrödinger said the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient. It gives a lot of factual information, but it is ghastly silent about all and sundry that is really near to our heart, that really matters to us. It cannot tell us a word about red and blue, bitter and sweet, physical pain and physical delight. It knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity. So we're in good company arguing that science is limited. It can only address the physical universe. It can't, and it can only address certain aspects of the physical universe, things that are testable. It can't address lots of other things that we care about. So we've seen some evidence for God this evening. But thus far, it's just evidence for a creator God, someone who created things. It's evidence for a piano maker, not a piano player. Is there any evidence that God is still active in the universe, that he's actually playing the piano, that he not only made the piano, but he's actually playing it? And that's the second question I want to look at this evening. Is God still active in the universe? The view of naturalism says no. Stephen Hawking said in 1988, these natural laws may have originally been decreed by God, but it appears that he has since left the universe to evolve according to them and does not now intervene in it. In the this is the view of deism, which was a 17th century heresy, Christian heresy. And the deists said that God created the universe and then he just lets it run. It runs like a machine and God's not doing anything now. When I was a kid, I remember coming home from school one day from, I must have been in some sort of science class. And I came home and I told my dad, I got it. I understand it now. God created all these natural laws and then everything just runs by the natural law. And my dad told me that was wrong. And he probably told me I was falling into deism and I didn't understand it. But I think many Christians today kind of fall into this deistic view of the world, that God made everything and now it just runs like a machine. Can we see God active in his creation? And if so, how? And I think there's 5 areas where we can see God active in his creation. There's interactions in history, fulfilled prophecy, answered prayers, changed lives, and miracles in natural law. So interaction in history, we especially see this in the Bible. We see God doing things in history, especially with the incarnation of Jesus coming to earth. And things today, it's a little difficult to say for sure that this is God interacting in history. But sometimes after the fact, we can figure that it probably was. For example, the formation of the state of Israel, many people think that that was God acting in history to form the state of Israel in 1948. Because Israel figures so prominently in prophecies in the Bible that many believe it has to come back as a nation in order to see those prophecies fulfilled. And then fulfilled prophecies, the second bullet here. There's many prophecies in the Bible, and many of them are very detailed. Naturalism would say, well, these prophecies are just vague, kind of like the oracle at Delphi said to Alexander, when Alexander went to find out whether he should wage war or not, the oracle told him, if you go to war, a great army will fall. Well, that's a pretty safe prophecy. It'll work whether he wins or loses. But biblical prophecies in the Old Testament, many of them are extremely detailed and even giving names and dates and things. So biblical prophecy is good evidence for God being active in the world. Answered prayer. Many of us who know God and pray have seen answered prayer. Naturalism would say, well, this is just random chance. It's just chance occurrences. But theism, biblical theism, would say that no, these are often too detailed. Answers to prayer are often much more detailed than one would expect from natural chance. And changed lives, I think this is one of the big ones. Francis Collins, who was the director of the NIH, is an outspoken Christian. He was an atheist medical student doing rounds with terminal patients. And he noticed that Christians had more hope than non-Christians. One patient asked him what he believed, and he realized he had never really looked at the evidence for atheism, so he began to. He looked at evidence for atheism, evidence for God, and he became a Christian as a result of that. He saw the changed lives of these terminal patients. Harry Ironside, who used to be here in the Bay Area, and he was a pastor in Oakland, or an elder in Oakland. He was street preaching one day in San Francisco, and an atheist challenged him to a debate. And he said, you bring me one person who heard your message of atheism, who was in the gutter, who had nothing to live for, and they heard your message of atheism and it turned their life around. He says, you bring me that one person, I'll bring you 10 people who heard the message of the gospel, who were in the same situation and turned their life around, gave them purpose. And then we'll have the debate. Well, the debate never happened. And I think, we recognize that the gospel changes people's lives. And atheism doesn't have the same power to change people's lives. We can know God, and he can change our lives too. And I think this is one of the strongest evidences for God's activity in the universe, is change lives. And then miracles and natural law. I believe we see miracles today, and but how do miracles interact with natural law? How does that work? According to naturalism, well, there's various thoughts in naturalism, but David Hume says it's impossible. He said it's impossible to break natural law. That if you have something you think is a miracle, it's just an unexplained natural phenomenon. Under biblical theism, miracles are God acting in the universe, but so is natural law. It's also God acting in the universe. How can a scientist believe in miracles? Well, we got to think about what natural law is. According to naturalism, this is the view of Stephen Hawking. Because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. It's not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. So he's pitting the laws of nature against God. It's one or the other. John Lennox replied the next day after Hawking made this quote, said Hawking's claim is misguided. He asks us to choose between God and the laws of physics as if they were necessarily in mutual conflict. But contrary to what Hawking claims, physical laws can never provide a complete explanation of the universe. Laws themselves do not create anything. They're merely a description of what happens under certain conditions. So he's saying that natural law doesn't cause things. It doesn't prescribe things. It describes things. All that science can say is that natural law describes what happens. It can't really say that natural law causes it, even though many scientists have that view. Donald Mackay said something very similar, said scientific laws do not prescribe what must happen. They describe what has happened. The earth does not go around the sun because Newton's or Einstein's law tells it, or makes it, or tells it to. The earth goes its own way, and the scientific laws are a generalized way of describing how it goes. Back when I was in graduate school, I had a discussion with my thesis advisor about some of these things, and I told him this was my perspective, and he thought about it a little bit, and he said, well, that's not how I look at it, but that's a tenable perspective, that natural law is just descriptive, not prescriptive, not causative. And if you're interested, Lennox and Mackay are both British Christians, and I think they got some of these ideas from C.S. Lewis, who was an English Don, Oxford Don. And he has a very good essay on the laws of nature in his book, God in the Dock. I haven't put the quote in here, but he was thinking about the laws of nature after a discussion, and it clicked in his mind that in the whole history of the universe, the laws of nature have never produced a single event. They just describe what happens. What does Scripture say about this, about God's activity in the universe? Psalm 104, he waters the mountains from his upper chambers. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of his works. He causes the grass to grow for the cattle and vegetation for the labor of man, so that he may bring forth food from the earth. So Psalms here, the psalmist says that God waters the mountains, but the water cycle was understood, the basics of it in Job 36. It talked about moisture coming down from the clouds as rain and then going up. They understood the basics of the water cycle, but still, the psalmist says that God is the one who waters the mountains. And verse 20 and 21, you appoint darkness, it becomes night, in which all the beasts of the forest prowl about. The young lions roar after their prey and seek their food from God. There's an interplay here. God and nature are working together. It's not God or nature, it's God and nature working together. Both can be true. And God can be working through the laws of nature. In the New Testament, Hebrews says he is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature. He upholds all things by the word of his power. He's before all things, and in him all things hold together. I think the biblical theist view of natural law and God's activity is captured by Richard Bube, who was former head of material science at Stanford. And he had said in one of his books, if God were to let go of the universe for a split second, it would cease to exist. God is upholding it all, holding it all together. And that's the view of biblical theism. So we have two worldviews here on natural law. Biblical theism, natural laws don't cause or govern things, they just describe things. Natural laws are description of God's normal operation in his universe. Nature is consistent only because God is consistent and unchanging. Miracles, then, are his unusual operation in the universe. It's something to get our attention or do something special. And back to the mouse and the piano. The pianist usually plays nice chords, but every once in a while he might play something dissonant to get the attention of the mice or of someone else in the room. And that's, I think, the view of biblical theism on natural law and miracles. Natural law is God's normal way of running things. Miracles is when he does something a little different. Jack Collins says, we should not say that a supernatural event has God more directly involved, while a natural event has him only indirectly involved. God is working directly in both kinds of events. So, under biblical theism, there's no reason to be afraid of natural science, no reason to be afraid of natural explanations for things. They don't push God out of the picture. They make our view of God richer. They show us how he's doing things. Under biblical theism, the piano is not a player piano. It has a pianist, and he's playing it constantly. Under naturalism, we live in a player piano. There is no pianist. And the natural law then becomes causative. It's given power to cause things and do things. Natural law, in fact, becomes pre-existent and eternal. In a sense, it replaces God. Romans 1:25 says they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the creator, who was blessed forever. So under naturalism, natural law becomes elevated and deified. Which of these two worldviews fits the data better? I think we could make either one fit, but under naturalism, you've got no room for miracles. And you have to say miracles don't exist. But under biblical theism, miracles are expected. So we've looked at some evidences here tonight for God, 6 different classes of evidence for God: design of the universe, existence of the universe, comprehensibility of the universe, mathematics, beauty, morality. And we've looked at 5 classes of evidences for God still being active in the universe: And then two worldviews, naturalism and biblical theism. Which view fits the data better? That's something we have to decide for ourselves. And I've not proven this evening that God exists, but I presented some evidence and hopefully convinced you that it is intellectually respectable to hold to a biblical worldview. We don't need to be afraid of scientists disproving God. For me, the strongest evidence to believe in God is that I know him. I have a relationship with him. It's existential, experiential, and we can all have that. And one last thought, in a sense, naturalism is kind of self-defeating. C.S. Lewis noted this back in 1944. If minds are wholly dependent on brains, and brains on biochemistry, and biochemistry in the long run on the meaningless flux of the atoms, I cannot understand how the thought of those minds should have any more significance than the sound of the wind in the trees. And I think he was onto something here. In one of his broadcasts, C.S. Lewis said, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes itself will give you a map of London. But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism. And therefore I have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought. So I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. So it's a little convoluted, but I think he makes a good point that if naturalism is all that there is, why should we trust any result of naturalism? And theism provides a better explanation, I believe. C.S. Lewis, in this same paper, said, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. We're all like mice in the piano, and we hear beautiful music being played constantly. We can deny there's a piano player, or we can recognize him and praise him, get to know him. We can actually know the God of the universe, the pianist, and getting to know him is the most convincing evidence of all that he exists. So I would invite all of you to think through these things, think about which worldview better fits the data. Oh, and I have some recommended resources. I'll just leave these up. There's quite a few here. But if you want to look into more of these things or more evidence, there's quite a few good books on this list.
And I see that Ray Uzel already has his hand up, so
Yeah.
we'll start with Ray.
Wait, I have to start my video. Okay, well, thanks for a very nice comprehensive talk. On the active side, I've wondered if the existence of the remarkable balance in nature could be used as an argument. I live in forest country and recently spent some time walking around in the forest with a forester, and he was explaining the microbiology going on under the ground and the insects and the plant diversity, incredible diversity of plant life and the animal life and the birds and this and that. And basically, every ecosystem can even be shocked by some event. Humans do stupid things and it'll repair and come back to balance. The fact that these diverse kinds of creatures somehow come in a balance is to me an evidence that there's an overall something at work. So I wonder what you thought of that as an argument.
Yeah, interesting. That might be a good argument. I haven't thought about it enough, but
I never see it in writing, and I wonder why. I mean, it can't be I'm brilliant or anything. It's just, it's but the balance of nature. I've scuba dived around a coral reef, and there's 1,000 different kinds of fish and different shaped noses, so they can uh, eat from the coral. I mean, it's just amazing the balance that there exists, and no creature takes it over. Only one that can take it over is us when we get really rambunctious.
Yeah, that's a good point, Ray. It has to have been created kind of in place all at once. Like another example, maybe is DNA, the DNA repair mechanism. You know, the just the fact that DNA can repair itself is incredibly miraculous, and that's just another example. But Kirk's presentation was really great. Appreciate.
Yeah, sorry that if the slides didn't come through, that's really too bad, because I just this last week bumped up my Comcast speed, so I think it should have worked, but maybe they didn't activate it yet.
Hey, Kirk, I think I heard Comcast is science-based.
Well,
So Kirk, maybe
it's
you
probably
can send
it's
Kirby your.
it's probably
your
financially
PowerPoint.
based rather than science based, but
Lothar, you were saying something?
Yeah, I've got a few comments. One is
Yeah.
maybe you could send Kirby your PowerPoint.
Yep.
Rather than, but the other thing
I will do that.
Ask you is there are a number of people like Stephen Meyer who talk about ID, intelligent design, and
Yep.
there's a whole group of people that mirror what you're saying, but they're also calling it intelligent design from a creator.
Yeah. And I think the design is, as I presented here, it's a strong evidence for God. But there's more than just evidence for design. There's also the beauty and these other things.
Mm-hmm.
God is not just an engineer, he's also an artist. And so all these things kind of come together.
Mm-hmm.
He is an engineer, but he's also an artist.
Well, and what would you say is the evidence for God is very clear cut, but who is that God? Is it the biblical God? And that question, I think, comes up because we know that even if we look at archaeology, we know that Jesus existed. In the Bible, he's talking about him being God. But how would you tie the two together?
Well, so this talk that I gave as part of a series on apologetics we preached at our church. And I had the second message after the intro. And so we hadn't yet gotten into the Bible and why to believe the Bible. So my message was just on evidence for God from nature. And I think from nature, you can see evidence for God, but you can't get a lot of detail about who exactly he is. You need scripture, you need special revelation to really understand God's character. We see some of it from nature, but to really know his character, we need the special revelation. So the God of the Bible, I think you kind of need the Bible.
But as Hugh Ross would say, that the nature and the Bible do not contradict one another.
Right, they don't. It's just when we're talking about God, nature gives us glimpses of him, but it doesn't give us detailed picture of exactly who he is and what his character is. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But Kurt, with you mentioned morality and beauty, then the universe has ugliness, a lot of ugliness in it. How do you argue? I mean, that seems to me that it's equal. I mean, even in the Bible, you know, you and I have had this discussion before, and I'm trying not to put you on the spot here, but
Uh-huh.
but you know, when you look at God and Abraham asking him to kill his own son, how is that moral? And then how is it moral to have children dying at the hands of predators, at the hands of, you know, everything else in the world? Why do we have, you know, these things that kill copious amounts of people, animals, and destruction? I mean, that's not beautiful.
Yeah, so those are difficult questions, and the problem of pain and suffering is a hard one. But if you go back to naturalism, I think you're forced into Dawkins's view that there is no good and bad, that you've got no basis for calling those things bad or evil. Why would we call all that kind of stuff evil? It's just the DNA doing what it does.
Pain.
Mhm.
It's pain.
So
There's other explanations to what we might consider evil outside of the Bible. But anyway, I'm sorry.
yeah,
I don't want to
yeah,
sidetrack.
no, I think that is one of the big issues, and I think it's a difficult question for Christianity to answer, but I think it's even harder for naturalism to answer. So ultimately, the answer that we have in Christianity is that whatever the cause for evil and pain and suffering, God himself entered into it by becoming a man and coming to earth and enduring pain and suffering himself and dying on the cross. So he entered into our pain and suffering with us.
But that going back to a kind of a naturalist view in science, is the beauty about science is that we form hypothesis, and then that hypothesis is tested, and then you're right, we don't prove it. We either
Yeah.
reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis of that.
Right.
And given that, it's very workable. It allows us to take theories that don't follow reality as we measure it and just let those go. And then another one, you know, we take what's true out of things and we keep it moving forward in science. That's the beauty of science.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that has given us things like Comcast.
Yep.
But I mean, it has given us a view of the universe that you know, the beauty that you see in the universe. We know the universe from that sort of rational thought. Yet
Mhm.
what you just said of, you know, God having a son and coming back to earth makes absolutely no sense from that standpoint. And so and as you know, that's a difficult thing that I've struggled with all my life with Christianity to overcome. So sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Mhm. No, I wasn't. Yeah. So you're on the one hand, it sounds, I don't know if I'd say ridiculous, but it sounds it sounds almost fictitious that God would
Mm.
come to earth, you know, and become a man and die on the cross. But if he's God, you know, he can do whatever he wants to do, and
Mhm.
this is what Scripture says he did. And you know, you can investigate the life of Christ, investigate the crucifixion, the resurrection, and there's good evidence to believe all of that.
Yeah, that does say that the gospel is foolishness to those that are, you know, perishing. So if
Yeah.
we're just looking at it through naturalistic eyes, it does seem kind of
Well,
nonsense.
if I can jump in here just to make a comment, you know, Christianity and God coming to earth has a beautiful answer in that in the eternity. but naturalism has no response to that. I mean, there is no eternity for naturalism.
Mhm.
You know, just everything ends when you die. And,
Oh,
Yeah.
you know,
but I
and
disagree. I think that what it gives us is that it's okay to say we don't know. We're not there yet.
sure.
So, and this is where I know Kirk mentioned the God of the gaps. This is where oftentimes, people will plug in God because we don't know. I have no problem, you know, quite honestly, I believe that we die and then I go back to the same place I was when I was born. I do not remember what it was like when I was born. I didn't exist before I was born. I feel I go back to that same place. Am I afraid of that? Absolutely not.
Mm.
Ray, looks like you were trying to say something,
Yeah.
but Dave
Well,
Adler is also, but can we go with Ray first? And then I think we need to end this part of the conversation and go on to Dave Adler's question. But go ahead, Ray.
okay, just on the problem evil, there's two classes of evil to explain. One is the evil caused by people, and theism or Christianity has an explanation for that, namely, we're fallen creatures. So the evil caused by people is explainable. The tough one is evil, in a sense, caused by earthquakes or natural causes, or how do we explain that? And I think what Kirby said about eternity is a possible explanation. These, if you picture this existence, this creation being a test, God's trying to grow certain kinds of creatures fit for the new creation. And the new creation is for eternity, as Kirby mentioned. All right. So any suffering for 10 years or 5 years or 50, whatever it is a nit compared to eternity. So I think the eternity part helps with the natural kinds of causes of pain, is the fact that we are looking for this reward that is eternal.
And can we move on to Dave Adler's question? Dave, can you unmute yourself and speak up?
Sure. Hi, thanks. Kirk, first of all, thank you. That was a very interesting talk. I think it was really well presented, and I enjoyed listening. Certainly a lot of food for thought. So I guess I have one comment that maybe I'll make and then let people respond to it, which is, I think it does a disservice to both science and faith to try and pit them against each other.
Mm-hmm.
And they try to answer different questions. Science answers the question how. It does not answer the question why. And you can go back, and I think it's something that philosophers of science will reiterate, over and over again. Science doesn't tell you why the universe works the way it does. It just tells you how it works.
Yeah.
And people make up laws of nature like gravity or electromagnetism. I think those are human inventions, and they help us understand the world, and they get replaced with better approximations like Einstein's theory of relativity or quantum mechanics as needed. But and I think a lot of scientists, including the ones you mentioned, especially Einstein, feel that they want to understand how the world works as an insight into God, that they're not mutually exclusive. As I understand it, the question of faith is more a question of why does it work this way, or why should we behave one way or another? But to me, faith tries to answer the question why. Science doesn't try and answer that question; it answers how. So I think it's a bit of kind of baiting for one side, and both sides, scientists and like Dawkins and many theologians try and create a animosity or a conflict. But I think that you hit on it, Kirk. If God made the laws of nature, then it's a religious study to learn how those work. And if you want to say, why do they work that way? That's a different question, and science is not going to answer that. I don't see any, the only time I see conflict is, like you said, if you try and say, well, you can't explain this with science, and then you say there must be a God, and then that's what you call the God in the corners, you know, because then when we answer a question scientifically, it puts religion on its on its heels, right? But I don't see why you can't believe in both and not see any conflict between them.
Well, I think I would agree with you, and I think most of us here would agree that there isn't, or at least shouldn't be, a conflict between science and faith. And that whole idea of conflict between science and faith was, you might know, there was a book written, I think it was the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, by White, the history of warfare between science and Christianity, or something like that. He was the head of, I think he was at Cornell. Was he the head of Cornell University? But anyway, he basically cherry picked things and tried to make a war between science and faith. And a lot of people have been working under that assumption ever since. But I think many people today would not see it as a war, a battle between the two. And I largely agree with you that science answers how things work, and theology answers why. I think that's a good way to look at it. Now, I want to say something else, though. Dave had said something to me earlier that he was going to ask me about testability. And if we look at scientific theories, they need to, or not testability, predictability, what it predicts. If we look at scientific theories, they predict new things. And so what does biblical theism predict? One of the things I mentioned tonight was Hoyle's idea about this mysterious resonance that nobody had discovered yet. And that was predicted based on what we'd now call the anthropic principle. But that's something that if you had said, well, God designed the universe, you might have predicted there must be something there to allow carbon to be created. And Reasons to Believe, that sponsors this group tonight, has what they call a testable creation model. And the testability, it's not quite as detailed as we usually see in science, but some of the things they predict are that as we study and learn more, we're going to see more and more evidence of fine-tuning, rather than see the fine-tuning disappear because we figured out how it works in science. So I don't know, that's just a couple things to answer your previous question.
And can we go on to Sabina? Can we go on to Sabina at this time?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was just going to pipe up and say about what Dave pointed out about that there is no real conflict between the two. That when I first ever met Kirk, it was also he who was speaking at Reasons to Believe, except that it was in person. And he was talking about famous scientists who also happened to be Christians, and that they were actually pursuing science in order to understand God's amazing creation better. So, yeah, and that's one of the things I also appreciate about Reasons to Believe. And by the way, I was not paid for this announcement. Just yeah, just the idea that, you know, God, I think it was August first mentioned this, the two-book idea. If it's God's earth or God's creation, God's universe, not just the earth, and God's word, the Bible, then they shouldn't be butting heads. If they seem to be, we're not getting one or the other better. This is something
Right.
that's really helpful to me.
Right. Great. Anybody else want to make a comment? So Lothar, go ahead.
I've got a comment on, you were mentioning that we know that the expansion rate of the universe is fine-tuned. If it went faster or slower, we wouldn't get the fusion of those helium molecules. Now, can you extrapolate that to that expansion rate? And the thought experiment would actually tell you that this is really an old universe rather than a young universe that some people propose.
Oh, yeah. If you look at the expansion rate, it goes back. You kind of run the tape backwards, and it's about 13.8 billion years ago when the universe began.
That I agree, but there are so many people that say we can prove scientifically that it's young, and I can. They always tell me, well, you're not getting it. It's even in the book of Job and so forth. And so I don't get it, because we do measure the age of the universe scientifically, not just from the microwave, the WMAP, microwave anisotropy probe, but also the Hubble from two independent. That also can, from the Hubble data, we can also calculate it as the same.
Yep.
So, but they still have these people, scientists, talking about a young universe, and it just boggles my mind.
I don't think that comes out of the scientific literature. I don't think you're going to find that in the scientific literature anywhere.
But there are some people that have a science background that expound on it.
There are people, yes, there are people who have studied science and claim that the universe is only 10,000 years old or so, and claim that they have evidence for that. And I've looked at maybe a dozen of these different evidences, and they're all bogus.
Yeah,
they're all either wrong data or they're wrong logic. I'm
trying to think of the scientist that he's actually a pretty good scientist in many other. He wrote a book on entropy, and well, I'll send that. I'll send that to you.
Is this a biologist?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard of this guy, and I'm not an expert on the biology. That's a good question for Kirby.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember his name. It's on the tip of my tongue.
Yeah, I know who you mean, and yeah.
I know who you mean.
RTV, Hugh and Jeff, I think, interviewed him a few years ago, and he's got some good ideas. But you know, he is stuck on the young Earth idea. So I guess without remembering exactly what his name is, or it's on the tip of my tongue too. Let's move over to John Yu, and please unmute yourself, John, and ask your question.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, Kirk, that's a really excellent talk. Very scholarly, very well delivered. So I think your church is getting a lot of benefit from your knowledge there, and that's wonderful. Praise the Lord. My comment is not so much of a question, but it's really a comment that this naturalism that we're talking about is a recent phenomenon. I put my thing on the group chat. I don't know if you guys had a chance to look at it, but it's more of a philosophical thing. I mean, the interest in naturalism and pitting it against faith, Christianity, I think it's it's a recent phenomenon. Because if you look at throughout the history of mankind, the existence of spirits, like either good spirits or bad spirits, were not challenged. Even in the Old Testament days, I mean, nations had their own gods, and they prayed to their gods, to fight in other nations who have a different God. And so we read a lot of that in the Bible. So the concept of Satan and God is not challenged through much of the history of man. And naturalism cannot explain evil spirits. They cannot explain Satan. And also they cannot explain God. So naturalism is a philosophy. I think it's a recent philosophy that stems from the pride of recent man who wants to deny God. And when you deny God, basically you want to be God. So it just comes from the pride of man. And so you can, and so the other comment I like to make is that you talked about the history, God's interaction, right? Do we see evidences of God today in the history of man? And we definitely do. And I think you touched upon that, but I think one of the key things that, we should emphasize is that God became man 2,000 years ago. He entered into his own creation. That's a miracle. And so, and then you also talked about you can't, God of the gaps and miracles. You can't explain miracle through our understanding of science. But if you think about the bigger aspect of what causes miracles, it's a different kind of laws that's happening. For example, you have times going backward, or wounds getting healed, or things getting fixed in our body in a miraculous way that the current physical law doesn't explain it. But if God can reverse all of these laws and processes and accelerate things, these things can happen. It's like dead rising again. It's like healing of cells, rapid healing of cells. But our physical laws cannot explain that. But God, if you go with the assumption God controls all these laws, he just changes the laws to make these things happen. And so man is smart enough to think about that way. You think out of bounds. And so if those things happen, then these things can happen, right? And we call them miracles. So that's the strongest evidence of God, because Jesus is God. So we had God here on earth. Is that people don't think that way. They think of Jesus not as God, as a man. But if you think Jesus is God, he's the strongest evidence.
I agree with you.
Yeah, but anyways, it's a beautiful talk. Very, very well put together. Yeah, congratulations.
And okay, Lothar, you want to have another comment?
Just a brief comment. It was Genetic Entropy by John Sanford.
Right.
That's it. Yep. That's
Now
the one
I
I was thinking
remember.
of.
Okay. Anyone else?
So okay, I have a question for Kirk. So one of the things you mentioned about as evidence for the existence of God is beauty. Now, do you have you ever been asked about there's several aspects of beauty, right? There's beauty in the things that you see in the creation or in looking at the skies and the sun and that sort of thing, right? What about beauty in ideas, right? Like beauty in some mathematical theorem, right? I mean, you put up those Maxwell's
Yeah.
equations, and I lived in those things for many, many, many decades, and so I see a lot of beauty in those as well. So
Yeah.
what's the reason why we find beauty in the language of mathematics? I mean, do you have any comments about that?
Well, I think that's another good evidence. Beauty, I just mentioned, I had some pictures of the cosmos, beauty of the heavens, and then I mentioned music, but I think we could expand that to beauty in all sorts of areas. And, why do we find it beautiful? Why do we, marvel at the beauty of any of these things?
Yes.
And if naturalism is true, why would it lead to us recognizing beauty? That seems to have no real, evolutionary advantage. Recognizing beauty or not, it's not, why do we recognize beauty?
Yeah,
And why do we think things beautiful? And
Great
when
questions.
I was when I was an undergrad at Purdue, a big engineering school, we didn't care about stuff like that. We just wanted the practical stuff. Just give me the engineering classes and the science classes, and we didn't want all those liberal arts classes. But there's the whole liberal arts area. Writing, poetry, good books. There's all kinds of beauty in areas that have no practical function for us to live, but we find it beautiful.
yes.
And
Yeah.
I think naturalism doesn't really have a good explanation for that.
So the one thing I could comment on beauty is that babies have been actually observed, and if they see two things that are ugly or beautiful, they tend to look at the beautiful. So we're hardwired for that.
Mhm.
Yeah. And that's interesting. So under naturalism, what would be the advantage of that? Is there some
Typically beauty in ideas, right? Not in the physical, but in ideas.
and
Yes.
beauty in ideas as well?
Yeah.
We
Yes.
recognize, or in music, that's something that's not tangible. It's sort of like an idea. I mean, but biblical theism, it's simple. I mean, God loves beauty, and so He's made us in His image, so we love beauty too.
Okay, so unless anybody has a really pressing question, I think that's a wonderful way to end this talk, that God loves beauty too. Any last minute comments or questions or for Kirk? Because if not, I'm going to ask Kirk to close this meeting with a word of prayer.
Just one last thing, sorry. Why the Bible? Why not the Quran? Why not the Bhagavad Gita? Why not the Upanishads?
Well, that's a good question. And the Bible is, well, they're all unique, I guess, in their own way, but the Bible is unique in what we just mentioned, that the creator of the universe has become part of his creation. He's become a person and come to live with us and come to suffer alongside of us and die for us. And those are aspects that aren't in any of those other books. And there's evidence that it's true. I haven't looked deeply at most of those other ones you mentioned. I've looked a bit at Islam, and much of Islam I don't see evidence for it being true.
But don't we have a responsibility to do so? As if we're going to be honest with ourselves, don't we have a responsibility to look at all avenues to see what that is out there? Okay, I'm done. Thanks, Kirk.
One of the our pastors at our church have been preaching about this recently, and so I just can't resist saying that Christianity seems to be anyway, and if any of you have a counterexample, I'd be interested in hearing about it. But Christianity is the only religion that preaches God's love. All the other religions, Islam, Hinduism, they basically all talk about how you've got to, the burden is on you to correct yourself because you're a sinful person, and if you don't correct yourself properly, you're not going to heaven. But Christianity is the only religion that said God did all the work already. He's already done the work for you, and he has saved you by his sacrifice on the cross.
The problem I have with that is he's not credible given his actions in the Bible itself. For example, Numbers 31. And I'm not going to go into this anymore. I just and I'm sorry, when I get into these discussions, these are very important things for me because I don't want to be buried into a lake of hell, a lake of fire. But I also don't want to get it wrong. And maybe the Upanishads are right. And maybe, I don't want to get that wrong either. So I have to hold everyone who has these thoughts accountable. It has to all make sense. This is where the scientific method is good in this regard, because we can discount those things that don't make sense, that don't follow. And for me personally, I really, really struggle with having faith because of what I read in the Bible. So, while people can stand in front of the pulpit and preach love, it's like I said before, a God that has Abraham put a knife to his own son that he loved very much is not a loving and moral act. And there's countless of them, obviously, if you guys know, there's countless of those situations in the Bible. So, all right. Anyway, thanks again, Kirk.
There's
Ray,
difficulties.
you want to comment on that?
Yeah, one point about first off, in its essence, Christianity is not asking you to believe a book. Christianity is pointing you to Jesus and believe in a person. So many of the stories in the Bible that are repugnant are part of a grand arching story that the most important part is the part that points to Jesus. Some of these other things are pointing to human nature and the fallenness of human nature, and many other things. But I think it's important to keep in mind that read the Bible looking for how is it pointing to a person, because that's what we're asked to believe in.
Well, I read the Bible looking and, trying to be objective about it, not, based on what you're telling me or what, anybody else is telling me. I have to take it as face value, like a child, right? Shouldn't I take it as a child and understand it in that regard? For me, it just doesn't work, and it hasn't worked, and I've tried over and over many times. So, anyway, sorry, I feel like I'm dragging us all on.
Yeah. Well, we don't have time to go into it all this evening, but there's some good books I could recommend that compare Christianity and other religions. Don't
worry about it, Kirk. Okay.
But you might be interested that the person who founded Reasons to Believe, Hugh Ross, talks about how when I think he was a teenager or high schooler, he looked into all the different world religions and he started looking at them one by one. And he started rejecting them because they conflicted too much with science, until he read the Bible and he read Genesis 1 and he could match it up fairly well with science. So that's interesting. The others all fit so badly that he had to reject them.
And who has the time to do it all? That's the other thing. The thing is, though, is I found a very simple thing in life that works for me. I try to love everybody. I try to love people and treat people like I would want to be treated. And that seems to have done me far better than any religion. So again, Kirk, I appreciate everything. And then I apologize to everyone if I've sounded contentious. It wasn't my intent.
No, that's fine. That's fine, Randy. Thanks. So yeah, I'll close in prayer and then let everybody go.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kirk.
Okay.
Lord, we thank you for this time this evening and for these things we see evidence of you in the world. And pray, Lord, that we would think about these things and pray, Lord, that we'd know how to help others to see evidence of you and that we would know you, that we would relate to you, that we would worship you in your name. Amen.